At the end of last week, the FBI arrested the man they allege made more than a half-dozen threats against Jewish centers in New York City. Now, the name may be familiar to BRIC TV viewers. Juan Thompson. He appeared on a BRIC Be Heard town hall on youth violence in June of 2015, as well as an episode of Straight Up. Now, Juan's arrest was all over the news this weekend, but we're going to start today's show by going past the headlines to some of the larger concerns raised by this and other events, and how they relate to mental health and our national political dialogue. Now, it's a tall order, so we invited the man who wrote the book on mental illness and political protest, a familiar voice here at BK Live, Dr. Jonathan Metzl. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here.
Thank you for being here, Jonathan. Welcome back. Okay, so your book, The Protest Psychosis, right, it delves into the history of the political abuse of psychiatry. But how could the current political environment affect someone who is mentally unstable? So kind of going reverse-a-roo there.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, let's start more broadly. It's a kind of natural human tendency in moments of political upheaval or stress to scapegoat other people. Many people do it on a kind of small, everyday level, and really only a small percentage of people who have this sense of kind of, well, gosh, I feel uncertain, I feel bad about myself, act in any way that leads to homophobia, Islamophobia, racism, anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, those kind of tendencies are exacerbated, particularly among people who are at high risk during moments of political stress, upheaval, uncertainty, and certainly I think a lot of the books on kind of this kind of projection and displacement are being rewritten in the current political climate. But I think the other part that's important to note is that this is not a question of mental illness per se. In other words, people who commit things like hate crimes or these kind of harassment episodes, they require a lot of planning, right? And so there's a lot of kind of executive function that needs to go into it. And so you're not really talking about people with severe schizophrenia or depression. These are really generally people who are aggrieved, you know, paranoid, feel like the world, exactly, something like that. And so in a way, what we see is that these kind of things intersect, which is people who have a natural tendency toward these kind of projections or scapegoating, then will be given permission by a larger political climate. And certainly in the present moment where we've got you know, a government running on blaming other people and things like that, it's not in any way surprising for me and other people who study this that we're seeing a rise in hate crimes and other kinds of hate acts.
So looking at this instance in particular and some of the vandalism that's happened at some cemeteries, as well as attacks on like Sikh people, and what Kansas was the latest one where people are actually being threatened and hurt and shot in some instances. How important is it that someone like a Donald Trump come out and say, not cool, not on my watch, this isn't the America that I want to be the leader of?
It's hugely important. In other words, what we need at this moment is leadership that we're not getting. So we need not just Donald Trump. I mean, obviously Donald Trump is the figurehead, but the government needs to come out and say, this is not tolerated. This is not who we are as Americans. We have a diverse, multicultural society, and the fact that it's taken so much prodding for the government to even make even the most base case. This case is obviously one case among many. It's horrible and tragic, but it's tied to desecration of Jewish cemeteries. It's tied to attacks on people of, you know, kind of other groups, as we're seeing. And so the circle just keeps widening. And in a way, what's happening is we're seeing, I think, a vacuum of leadership that's really perpetuating this. The government needs to take a strong stand, and it's clearly not doing so.
Right, no, and it's actually perpetuating the opposite, right? Vilifying immigrants and immigrant communities and doing all that it can to say, we're going to do what we can for the victims of immigrant criminals rather than the other.
Right, no, and also the government itself, I think in a lot of the rhetoric itself seems to be claiming that it is the victim, right? And so in a way, this just plays into this sense that you know, we're under attack. But the problem is we
have to take matters into our own hands.
Exactly, and what we see is that the circle just keeps growing, right? And so
as evidenced by your book and the sort of dark history of the way that the field of psychiatry treated some people of color and marginalized groups, is there something that you would impart on those communities now, whether they're being marginalized in the political climate or have historically been, that would bring them to the field to say, okay, things are different now if they are in fact, or how to seek help if someone close to you or you yourself might be experiencing some of these thoughts?
That's a great question. I think there are two parts to that question. One is just to ask, why is it that communities of color distrust the mental health field? And I think part of the issue, as I show in my book, The Protest Psychosis, part of the issue is that there's a long history of using basically usually black political protest to delegitimize larger political movements in a certain kind of way. So we saw this with Malcolm.
Say they're crazy.
Exactly.
Right.
We called Malcolm X.
Aggressive and hateful.
Exactly. And so we didn't have to listen to what they're saying. And so Malcolm X wanted guns for self-protection. Oh, that's mental illness. Huey Newton, the Black Panthers. In other words, what happens is there's a larger history of using the rhetoric of mental illness to delegitimize entire valid civic movements. And I think we're seeing this again now, unfortunately, in the aftermath of what happened with Mr. Thompson, that people are trying to tie this to Black Lives Matter, to larger things. It's actually not related in any way at all. And so partially, the rhetoric of mental illness has been used to squelch, Black strivings for civil rights in a way. And so there's certainly that. And then the other part is just I don't think the mental health communities have done a good enough job of reaching out. In other words, like we used to call this in the old days, white norms of psychiatric diagnosis. That in a way, the idea of what mental illness is the person who can buy an antidepressant on an advertisement.
Who can afford therapy.
Exactly. And so I think that in a way there are pushes within psychiatry right now to say, let's actually look at not just about the serotonin imbalance or who can afford Prozac or something. It's also like, what about racism? Does that cause mental illness? What about being oppressed? What about factors like that? And so in a way, these are important, challenging questions for mental health.
Short answer, yes.
Absolutely. Yes.
Don't have a PhD or anything.
Yes, Jonathan, it's never enough time, but we are out of time with you. Thank you so much for joining us,
My pleasure. To be continued.